Right, okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us for this historic launch of Labour for a New Democracy.
Sandy,
sorry.
Just before we kick off, I'm so sorry.
It said meeting started at the top of my page.
It's started, but people are still
Okay.
bundling into the room.
Okay.
So just give it a minute or two.
Filling up.
It was a perfect start, but you can do it again.
Clive has said he's struggling to connect.
Tell him it was easy from New Zealand.
Yeah, you've probably got better IT in New Zealand than they've got in Norfolk.
Oh, I don't know. Anyway, the numbers are going up fast. 165.
That's an outrageous slow on Norfolk. Oh, I mean, okay. Sorry, I had a technical issue. I hadn't turned the computer on.
Oh, that helps.
I'm joking. The link wasn't working.
So it looks like attendance has sort of stabilized, so I think we can make a start, Sandy.
Okay, right. Thank you all so much for joining us for this historic launch of Labour for a New Democracy. My name is Sandy Martin, and I am the chair of the Labour campaign for electoral reform. The majority of Labour Party members support proportional representation for Westminster, 76%, according to a YouGov poll last December. So we recognise the golden opportunity to secure a firm commitment from our party to change the way we elect our governments. But we also recognise that we need to work to secure that commitment, and that we need to work alongside all the other organisations that are committed to a better democracy in Britain. That's why we're so thrilled to be working closely with all the other organisations that have come together to form Labour for a New Democracy. Make Votes Matter, Compass, the Electoral Reform Society, Unlock Democracy, Open Labour, Another Europe is Possible, Politics for the Many, and Labour for a European Future. I want to thank everyone in all of those organisations who's worked to make today's launch possible and who will continue to champion the cause of a meaningful democracy for our country. And I know there are other progressives and democratic socialist organisations out there who can and should join us, and I'm sure some of them will do so in the coming weeks. Working together, we will achieve that firm commitment at next year's party conference. I'm so honoured to introduce to you someone who is at the heart of a democracy which has actually achieved the change we're seeking when she was Prime Minister of New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern and the New Zealand government are rightly respected around the world for their sane and effective governance in a world where failure and bigotry seem to be the norm. But the foundations of New Zealand's current success were partly laid by our first speaker here today. Helen will speak to us about her experiences, and then we will have a question and answer session, and then our great UK lineup will speak to you, and that will take up the first hour. And then if you stick with us after that first hour, we will have breakout sections and form action plans for the coming year. So without further ado, Helen, it's an honour and a privilege to be able to hear from you today. Colleagues and comrades, Helen Clark.
Well, thank you, and great to be able to join and offer some information on the New Zealand experience with going to a proportional representation. And let's say, you know, at the outset, it can be quite a scary prospect for major parties. It certainly was for me when I was the deputy leader of the opposition, and the two referendums on it were held in New Zealand. And then, of course, becoming leader of the opposition, I had to help reshape Labour to compete within the new environment. So it's not surprising that major party leaders often feel, do we really need to do this? So let's just go through a little bit of the background and context to it in the New Zealand experience and where it's led us to today. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, there was a third party in New Zealand which very occasionally got a seat in Parliament called Social Credit. And Social Credit was capable of scoring up to 20% of the vote, but getting one seat in an 80 or so member of parliament. And of course, there was a sense of great injustice about that from its supporters. But they were a small party, so they were never going to carry the day. I think a bit of the turning of the tide in public mood began in the 1978 and 1981 election aftermaths. In those two elections, the New Zealand Labour Party polled more votes than the Conservatives, the National Party, but won fewer seats. So Labour people started thinking this isn't fair. Now, of course, the following election, 1984, Labour won and won quite well, and it won a majority and won quite well again in 1987. So the issue went away for Labour. And I think often when major parties hold out against proportional representation, it's because they think just one more heave, one more heave and we'll get the majority that we've been wanting. But then, frankly, with a large majority like that, also single party governments are often empowered to do things which they haven't been very frank with the electorate about. And that was certainly the case with New Zealand Labour. And by the time it limped out of office in 1990, there was a great feeling of distrust because of the program of privatisations in particular, and people feeling that they hadn't really voted for what they got. So they voted for the Conservatives, who had quite a soothing message. And hey presto, they came into power and accelerated what had been seen as the structural reform, neoliberalism agenda. And so even within a year of that 1990 election, people were completely fed up. They say you vote for one thing in this country and you get the opposite. Now, interestingly, in the 1990 election, the head of the Conservative Party, Jim Bolger, promised a referendum if elected. I think his party never forgave him for it, but he promised it. And true to his word, referenda were held. Now, interesting, and I think interesting to Labour, sort of rethinking the history of Brexit, it was never the case that this was going to be decided on a single referendum. New Zealand started on a process, recognising the significance of this, because an electoral reform is at the core of constitutional reform. There were two referenda. 1992, people were asked two questions. The first one was, do you want to change the electoral system of New Zealand or not? A staggering 85% of people said they wanted to change the system. That shows you how fed up they were with everybody, with the Labour Party, the National Party, with everybody. So in that referendum, there was a second question, and it said, regardless of how you voted on the first question of whether you want change or not, if there were to be change, which of the following options would you like? And it put four options. One, I think you call in the UK alternative vote. It's preferential voting, as in the Australian lower house. That only got 6%. There was another option put called supplementary member, which got 5%. Single transferable vote, which is the Irish system, and the way the Australian Senate is elected, got 16%. The mixed member proportional system, the German style system, which had had the main campaign around it, got 65%. 2/3 of Kiwi voters saying that's what we want. And so the undertaking from the indicative referendum that the government gave was that it would then draw up through the proper parliamentary processes an act of parliament for the majority or the greatest preferred system that came through this, and put that to the electorate in 1993. And so in 1993, there was quite a thorough process of drafting and consultation, and MPs did a study tour, I think, to Germany. So a fully developed act of parliament went to the 1993 referendum, which was also a general election year, so you're going to get a good turnout at that. Now, at that point, the referendum passed 54% to 46. So you can see it came down quite significantly because the no campaign got quite a bit of traction because, again, people are always a bit concerned about change. But nonetheless, it passed 54 to 46 and it became law. Now, then, of course, each of the political parties had to try to position for the first MMP election in 1996. And this would be very relevant to such a transition for Britain's political parties. Now, I became leader of the Labour Party just after that election. And it was a very difficult transition, both for me as a new leader, but also because with the prospect of parties being able to be startups and get seats in Parliament, a lot of people were trying their luck. And so I could see elements of Labour support going all over the spectrum. Some of it was going to a party that positioned to the left of us, the Alliance. Some of it went to the New Zealand First Party, which is still in the Parliament today. You could say eclectic, nationalistic kind of party. Some of it actually went all the way across to the right of the Conservative Party. The people who had, for example, supported the main neoliberal thrust of the fourth Labour government. And there was another small party that also took some people. So my job was to try to reposition Labour as a coherent, mainstream social democratic party in this much broader spectrum of possibilities for party representation in the Parliament. And that first election was not easy. I mean, we got about 28%. New Zealand First did quite well, got almost half as much as we did. The party to the left of us, it did okay as well. Now, from that election, Labour could have led a government with the party to the left of it and the eclectic New Zealand First Party, but we went through 9 weeks of negotiation, as did the National Party, with the eclectic New Zealand First Party, and they decided to go with National. And I always thought that actually in the long term, that worked better for us because we didn't have the teething problems of being the first government under proportional representation and trying to make it work. And we learnt a lot from watching what happened as that coalition government actually broke up quite spectacularly. So I think it would be of interest to people to know how you do govern in this sort of system. Every election since 1996 under this new system has never delivered a single party majority government. Ironically, this one might, it might not, but this is probably one of the most realistic prospects for that happening. Because normally I think voters like to keep a bit of a check on the big parties. So there is a tendency to vote for small parties to keep that check. So the 9 years that I was Prime Minister, I always led a minority government. And particularly by the last term, I had to become quite inventive constitutionally to form that. So at the core of our government was always a coalition, and it was with the Alliance Party, which had positioned to the left of us. But as time went on, we developed support agreements called confidence and supply agreements with other parties that they would support us on our budget and other confidence measures. And that's what then gives the Governor-General, in your case, the Queen, the confidence that when a party leader goes to him or her and says, I can command a majority in Parliament, that you actually can. You can show those formal agreements. Now, what does this mean then for the kind of results you can get as a government? Some people will say it'll be completely paralysed by all the negotiation and nothing will ever happen. That is not my experience. My government was an extremely busy government, and it did some big and major reforms and big and major new initiatives. But what MMP, what proportional representation required us to do, was build up consultation mechanisms that we'd never been used to when we were a single party majority government in the past. And so ministers needed to know their counterparts in the support parties very well. The staff in their offices needed to know them very well. The party leaders needed to know each other very well. You needed to operate on a no surprises basis. And we actually put a new feature into the cabinet manual, which is the basis of cabinet government, I'm sure in the UK as in New Zealand, which had an agree to disagree provision. Because conventionally in Westminster style government, if someone doesn't agree with a majority decision of the cabinet, they leave the cabinet. Well, we said we can't have cabinets collapsing all the time just because a smaller party doesn't agree with something the major party wants to try and rally support for in the parliament. So the agree to disagree procedure was set up. So, even though I led for 9 years a minority coalition governments with this range of parties involved and range of agreements, we did provide stable government. No one thought the government was unstable because it had all these mechanisms for consultation and no surprises, which kept it that way. Now, one question you might ask is, how has this bedded down with the public? Does the public want change? Now, of course, going back to 1993, there were 46% of voters who in the end voted that they didn't want MMP. And in the 2008 election, as I recall, the National Party, the Conservatives, promised to hold another referendum on MMP to ask the people what they thought. Well, actually, in that referendum, the proportion of New Zealanders voting who supported MMP went up from 1993. So in 1993, it had been 54%. In the 2011 referendum, it was 58%. So, hey, go figure. Any of us would be very happy with 58% as a party vote. 58% is a clear majority. They were also asked a second question, which was, if a majority want to change again, what would you change back to? Well, the old first past the post system came through, top of the pops there, as you would expect. But bottom line, close to 60% of voters did not want it to change. Now, what about some of the myths around proportional representation? Some people say it gives power to extremists. That is not our experience in New Zealand. Actually, the balance, in a way, tends to be in the middle, as everywhere, whether it's the German system between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrat and their sister party, with sometimes the Free Democrats holding the balance. In Britain, we saw in the election where Labour was defeated at the end of Gordon Brown's term, the Liberal Democrats held a balance and they supported the Conservatives. I should say that up until the 2017 election, the largest party from the election always led the formation of the new government. The exception to that was 2017, where Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party negotiated with the New Zealand First Party. And even though Labour had fewer votes, and quite significantly fewer than the National Party, New Zealand First elected to give Labour a chance. So that was an unusual outcome, but an entirely legitimate one under the system, because in the end, there's no point being the biggest party in the parliament if you don't have any friends to help you govern. And the National Party had put itself in that position. So rather than power going to the extremists, it tends to go a bit to more the middle of the road, in my observation. Now, some people might say, well, proportional representation will mean the end of the UK Labour Party. Well, I must say, as Labour Party deputy leader and then leader, I had real worries that it might mean the end of the New Zealand Labour Party. But, look, as parties, we are capable of reinventing ourselves to operate well in whatever the system is. And we did reinvent ourselves to operate well in it. And I, for one, would not support change back again. As I say, people sometimes allege that governments under MMP which require coalition and other arrangements don't get much done. That's not my experience at all. You can get a great deal done. People ask, are MPs still accountable under proportional representation? Well, directly, yes, the electorate MPs are accountable. And one of the good features of MMP, which is why I think it can resonate with New Zealand and with British voters, is you do keep an electorate MP. In New Zealand, the split between electorate MPs and list MPs is roughly 50-50. That means the electorates are about twice as big as they used to be, but nonetheless not ginormous by UK standards. The list MPs, of course, the accountability is more indirect, more through the party itself and its performance. But I think it's perfectly fair to say that there is accountability under the system. In the UK, some people might say, well, haven't we had a referendum on PR and rejected it? Well, you didn't really. You had a referendum on a preferential voting system, and that's not proportional representation. Interestingly, as I said, when that was put on the list of options in the 1992 indicative referendum in New Zealand, 6% of people voted for it. So that's not what they wanted. They wanted proportional representation, and they wanted a good form of it. And MMP is quite a pure form of it. Pure in the sense that you have the two votes. One vote is for the electorate, the other for the party. And the eventual composition of the parliament mirrors the party vote. With this minor qualification, that to be represented in the New Zealand Parliament, a party must poll 5% of the vote or win one seat. If it wins one seat and say 3% of the vote, it'll bring probably 4 or 5 other MPs in. If it wins no seat and 5% of the vote, it won't bring any in. Now, of course, there has been some complaint about that over the year. Is that fair? But basically, that threshold does mitigate against perhaps the kind of proliferation you see in the Italian system or the Israeli system, where you have many very, very tiny parties. We don't get that. I think the most we've had elected in the parliament is about 7 different parties, and it's under that at the moment. So that would be my tour de table, if you like, of our experience with it. But I hope I've said enough to provoke some questions and interest. And let me conclude where I began. It's not unusual for party leaders to fear a change like this. I did. But the reality is, if there's momentum for it and the public are looking for something like this, most definitely major parties can make it work. And over time, it becomes seen as a good way of doing things.
Thank you so much, Helen. Are you able to take some questions now? And would you
Definitely
prefer to have them in thirds or one at a time? In 3 or 1 at a time?
Try 3, and that will stop me repeating myself.
Okay. Well, the first question we've got comes from Ian Mallet, and I think you've partly answered this anyway, but do you want to describe the way in which the government in New Zealand is similar to the German system, and whether or not it is different from the Scottish system, and also what arrangements do you have for local government? They have a single transferable vote for local government in Scotland.
But maybe let me answer that one then, because it's a bit technical and I'll forget the details. I think ours is quite similar to the way the German system works, which is not surprising because we modeled it precisely on the German system. And as I say, Germany also has its great political parties. It's Christian Democrats and their barbarian allies, and the Social Democrats, a very long and proud tradition. struggling a bit in the polls at the moment, obviously. The Christian Democrats have often relied in the past on the Liberal Democrats for the majority, but they've also a number of, well, several times in recent elections had grand coalitions of Conservatives and Social Democrats. And I suppose New Zealand hasn't gone down that route. And I don't think in a way it's a very attractive route, because if the two major tendencies come together, then the opposition will form to the extremes. And you saw in the last German election, the neo-Nazis getting, what, 17, 18% of the vote, which is quite a scary thing for Germany itself. So while when we began, we looked more like the German system with a party in the middle kind of calling the shots, and the Greens more naturally aligning with Social Democrats, in the end, this formation of grand coalitions is not something that we have followed, and I would think it would be extremely unlikely in the New Zealand context, and unlikely in the British context, I'd suggest. The Scottish system, I'm not so familiar with, although, you know, often looking from outside, Scotland looks a little bit like a one-party state, so it tends to live at quite big majorities. But as I understand, it hasn't required coalitions. But, you know, here we are, 1996, 24 years ago, first MMP election, no single party majority government elected out of that at all. This might be the first time, this time it might not, but the system in a way is designed not to deliver that. At local government, we have first past the post. There might be some minor variation somewhere, but generally that's the way it's done.
Right, okay, I've got a question from Monica Threlfall, who asks, Helen, how are the list members of Parliament accountable? Is there some sort of accountability mechanism for the list MPs? And I've also got a question from Ruth Cadbury. Prior to either of the two referenda, was there any form of public engagement in considering the different options for electoral reform, and can we learn from that? And the third question is, do you think that there are, this is from James Corrie, do you think there are any legitimate alternatives to a referendum as routes to such a significant constitutional change, given that quite a lot of people in this country feel that referenda can be quite divisive?
Well, and not surprisingly, given recent experiences, both with the Scottish independence referendum and then, of course, Brexit. Look, on the public accountability of list MPs, there's no public mechanism as such. So you could say that the accountability then has to come through two other routes. One, of course, is media, and media do hold MPs to account, and should. You know, that's the function of the fourth estate. But it's also the party that needs to hold them to account as to whether they perform or not. And you do see when parties produce their lists for an election, poor performers tend to be dumped down lists to a point where they may struggle to get elected at all. So that it's that internal mechanism that's probably the most deadly for a low performing MP. I don't see in the New Zealand context so much sort of de-ranking of people on lists, party lists, because of factions. It's more around a performance issue, or a need for certain greater demographic diversity might be another driver of it. Now, Ruth asked, what about public engagement and the options? Well, there was an electoral reform organisation in New Zealand that worked very, very hard for MMP and you know, to sort of make the case to the public about the need for change. So the public was quite sensitised to the options, and I think the four options that the government put in the 1992 referendum would have been seen as, you know, 4 fair options to put. Then when MMP came out as much the preferred option from an electorate, which was 85% wanting a change of system, the legislation was drawn up and went through, you know, well-considered select committee processes in the Parliament. So the public also had input and voice at that point. So I've never heard it said that there wasn't public engagement. There was a great deal of public engagement around the whole process. James asked, do you need to have a referendum to make these changes in effect? Is that what makes it legitimate? You know, in countries like the UK and New Zealand, we are among the few in the world that don't have a written constitution as such, right? We draw on different documents and key act, whether it's Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Letters Patent, and of course, the Electoral Act is a key constitutional document. So I think to change the Electoral Act, you do need a considered process of public consultation. And a 2-stage referendum is quite a good way to do that. Our process asked people, do you want to change? 85% yes, please, relief, please. And then if it's going to happen, which of the options do you want? There was a clear winner out of that. Then you work up that proposal, full public engagement around that process. You go back to the public with it, and they voted for it. So that gave the change enormous legitimacy. And I think just to legislate for it in Parliament probably wouldn't give that legitimacy. A 1-stage referendum, I don't think would be sensible either.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I'll give you 3 more questions. Is there a specific role for list MPs in the system you have? That's from Nathan Mann. From Harold Emmanuel, what did the Labour Party need to do in New Zealand in order to reinvent itself? And then thirdly, there was a question I saw from Mary Southcott, which was about your own personal journey, because I think you were opposed to MMP to start off with. And what was it that made you change your mind?
So on the list MPs, the parties allocate the work that they want done. So let's say your party is in opposition. The list MPs, like the electorate MPs, will be given some kind of portfolio or spokesperson responsibility. Now, the electorate MP, of course, has an electorate to service, and the list MP often will have an office looking like a constituency office in the electorate held by another party. So I'm an electorate MP from the Labor Party, and they're probably going to be somewhere a national MP is going to put an office in my electorate and also, you know, compete for profile. For the minor parties who don't have so many MPs, they will select where they want offices. You know, they may have, you know, MPs. They'll probably have MPs living in a range of centres, so they'll make sure that they have a shop front and the staff that they're entitled to. They may pool resources. So that's the way it works. In government, actually, to be a list MP would be a real bonus if you're a busy minister, because busy ministers have to service electorates as well as run portfolios. But you know, I was an electorate MP throughout my career, so you do that willingly, of course. Now, how did Labor reinvent itself? Well, there's quite a change of mindset, I think, from going from being one of 2 broad churches to being a party on a spectrum. And as I said, in the run-up to MMP, we lost supporters and MPs to the right of us, the left of us, the eclectic of us, and we had to rethink really what would characterise the program of a social democratic party in today's world. So we had to rethink a more coherent philosophy rather than trying to accommodate a very broad range of views. And I believe the National Party went through much the same sort of process. So it's not a question of sort of dividing the electorate into two halves and, you know, and having too broad a church. You can have something more coherent. I mean, I'm conscious as I say this that the UK does have some more diversity of representation historically than we've had. You've had the Liberal Democrats, which have been there as a centrist voice, and then you've had the nationalist parties, whether it's been SNP or the Plaid, or you know, you've had the Ulster Unionists as a regional party, Social Democratic Labour Party in Northern Ireland, and so on. But for us, it was quite a radical change to see a broader spectrum, and we had to have a coherent philosophy within that. On my personal journey, as I say, I was extremely concerned about what the transition to MMP would mean for the Labour Party. And actually, I have to say the first election was extremely difficult because we were going into it in a difficult position anyway. Our polling wasn't good. Needless to say, if you were to be writing the rules in the UK now with Keir Starmer polling and Labour really polling quite well, I think you'd be in quite a strong position. That's unlikely to happen, I guess, for this election because you're not calling the shots on policy and referenda. But anyway, we weren't in a strong position. Our vote slumped from 1993 to 1996 as other parties did better in the proportional representation environment. But in essence, my personal journey of being opposed to it ended when the public voted for it. You know, when the public votes for it, you stop fighting it. You say, okay, that's it. The public's decided, that's what they want, and it's my duty as a party leader to make this work constitutionally for New Zealand, and also, of course, to position the party to the best advantage in it.
Thank you. The referenda that we've had in the United Kingdom in recent years have been very emotional. Adam Page asks, was there an emotional argument to be made for constitutional change? Like we saw with most of our recent referenda, most people voted with their hearts and not with their heads. And I think we'd better finish with this question because we've got many other speakers, but I think that's a very good question to finish with, Helen.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't anything like as emotional as, as the Brexit referendum, which was like an existential question, wasn't it? But it was quite hard fought. And of course, one of the key arguments was if you get MMP, the bronze medal winner will decide which of the gold and silver actually gets to form a government. So there's quite a lot around that. But, you know, in the end, a program of government has to command a majority of parliament. And there's no point sulking if you can't get your program over the line in negotiation with the others required to make up the parliamentary majority for that. So I don't see it as the tail wagging the dog. It is a process of negotiation. There may have been a question that I said on screen, or did I forget to deal with it earlier? The 9 weeks negotiation after the first MMP election in 1996, the public did get very sick of that, and the media got sick of it. And I think the third party, New Zealand First, which was being negotiated with by both Labour and National, it probably got most of the criticism for that. But again, this was uncharted territory. We'd never had to do this before. Just one tip that came out of that. In the 9 weeks of negotiation, basically the two parties sat down with their manifestos, Labour and New Zealand First, Conservative and New Zealand First, and negotiated a program of government. Now, when National and New Zealand First went into government together, they had a program for government, which actually neither of them were totally committed to, because they'd had to compromise so much on it. And in a way, the next 3 years was about that falling apart. So learning from that, when we were in a position to form a government after the 1999 election, we were on the public record as saying that we would work with the alliance, which was positioned to the left of us. And we decided that we would not have a detailed agreement around the program of government. The agreement we had with the alliance simply said that we would work together in good faith to form a strong government, and that there would be an agree to disagree mechanism should it be needed. As time went on, there weren't detailed programs I had in the other post-election agreements for government either, but sometimes you could get something a bit annoying become an absolute red line. So after the 2002 and 2005 elections, a minor party that we needed to do business with had a bee in its bonnet about cannabis law reform, and specifically wrote into the agreement that the government would not move in that direction, which was incredibly frustrating. And I'm still fighting and advocating around this issue today. But then you ask yourself, are you not going to form a government because of that one issue? Well, no, because there's thousands of other issues that you want to get on with and progress. But that was irritating. But hey, that's the breaks. We had 9 years of government.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Helen. That was absolutely brilliant. There is a sense in which New Zealand represents a vision of what the United Kingdom could be like. And in many ways, of course, the United Kingdom is very different from New Zealand. It always will be. But one thing we do share with New Zealand and Germany and South Africa and the United States and India and every other country on earth, British people want their views to be respected. And a democracy which gives no value to their votes is no democracy at all. Thank you so much, Helen. And now, because this is a very much a joint event, I'm going to hand over now to Neil Lawson, who will be taking us through the next part of, from Compass, who will be taking us through the next part of the event.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sandy. And thank you so much, Helen. It's so reassuring to know that this can be done and done successfully. And if you can do it, we can do it. So it's a brilliant example and a brilliant case study. So thank you very much for your time and everything that you've done to spur us on in terms of our democratic revolution that we need here in the United Kingdom. So moving on quickly, we've got 4 great contributions lined up, short contributions before further Q&A, before you move into some kind of work sessions about how we actually do this stuff. So right now we're going to be joined by Clive Lewis, the MP for Norwich South, and then Debbie Abrahams, the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth, then Tessa Milligan, who is the co-chair of Open Labour, and then last but not least, Alex Sobel, the Labour MP for Leeds North East and Shadow Minister for Arts, Heritage and Tourism. So over to Clive Lewis. Clive, how are we going to get to the point where Labour is virtually, the only social democratic party in the world, virtually, that doesn't support equal voting? How are we going to do it, Clive?
Yeah, you don't get to ask the questions. I know what I'm going to say, so that's. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to answer that anyway. I'm going to answer that. But first of all, just say thank you for Campaign for New Democracy and this brilliant initiative. It's so good to be able to speak after Helen Clark. It's such a privilege as well. So thank you very much for the invite, and apologies to Neil, I was only joking. And look, to ensure I gave a realistic conference address, fringe address, I stayed up till I think about 4:30 last night, drinking cheap wine and dancing to bad music. So the resulting lack of sleep and hangover should give an authentic feel to the talk today. I can see hardcore kind of party conference goers there laughing at that. Well, that's all right. Look, now I understand that the Labour Campaign for New Democracy is about convincing Labour members to adopt PR as party policy. Because without the Labour Party committed to PR, I can see no way for it to happen under first past the post. Now, the usual tactic revolves in part around convincing our members that this will benefit the Labour Party electorally, because electorally speaking, the 20th century was the Tory century. In the last 100 years under first past the post, the Tories have won 3 times as many general elections as the Labour Party. Here in the 21st century, they've already won twice as many elections as we have. In effect, they're 4-2 up. So you'd think it would be easy to convince our party to get behind an electoral system that leveled out the elections playing field, but it isn't. Why is that? Well, I think there are two main reasons. The first is because our party is hooked on the trappings of oppositionalism, hooked on occasionally being in government. Hey, we might not be doing great, but at least we're doing better than the Lib Dems and the Greens. It means we get more short money, more political airtime. In effect, all the fabulous trappings of second place in a winner-takes-all system. At least in England and Wales. It used to happen in Scotland, not anymore. That's another story, perhaps a little later in today's discussion. The other reason is because of something called Labourism, that unique British socialist and social democratic belief that only the Labour Party can ever be a force for progressive change in this country. Now, why is that a factor? Well, because in an electoral system that is stacked against us, on the rare occasion that we can or we do cobble together an effective electoral coalition, we don't have to play nicely with others. We get to be like the Tories and impose our policies on the country and on Parliament. It's not about compromise or working with others. It's our way or the highway, and because that's what and how politics works in this country under first past the post. But it doesn't have to be that way. And that's why we as a campaign have to appeal not to the partisan winner-takes-all mentality that has so often dominated our party's approach to electoral change. Rather, we need, one, to appeal to the better nature of our socialism, and two, emphasize the wake-up call that this is part of the crisis of democracy that confronts all progressives around the world. Now, let me briefly take each of those in turn. On the better nature of our socialism, it's this. As a party, we need to practice far more humility and understanding. We need to embrace the fact that a progressive future will not be dictated by the Labour Party alone. And even if we could dictate it, we should shy away from it. Rather, we should embrace collaboration and negotiation. But that is exactly what first past the post seeks to prevent. But ultimately, all this ties in to the crisis of democracy. And by that, I mean the erosion of democratic norms, the rise of authoritarian nationalism, surveillance capitalism, and the ensuing climate crisis and its effects. Because let's be very clear, if our democracy and many others across the world were functioning properly, we would not be on the brink of climate catastrophe. Because people don't vote for the Arctic Circle to burn, just as they don't vote for the increasingly likely ecological collapse that we're facing and the famines that will result. Of course, PR isn't a silver bullet. It won't miraculously fix these issues, but it is a strong base on which we can build a more collaborative politics, help forge a better political culture amongst progressives of all hues, because without that, we will continue to be divided and ultimately conquered. So leadership means many things, but if the Labour Party wants to lead a progressive thinking throughout the 21st century, then let's do so by example, in a spirit of pluralism and engagement. If so, that starts by our party embracing and getting behind a fairer electoral system as part of a new radical constitution fit for the 21st century. Thank you.
Brilliant, Clive, fantastic. Right, bang on message, well done. And time as well. Debbie, over to you. Give us your 4 minutes on why we need to do this. Thanks so much for being part of this and all the work you've been doing on PR. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neil. Yes, I mean, there are many reasons for supporting this campaign, and I congratulate everybody that has been involved in this. But for me, this is about addressing inequalities, and it's why I got into politics, why I became an MP. So our movement's focus has tended to be on inequalities in terms of income and in terms of wealth. We know from totemic pieces such as The Health Divide, The Spirit Level, and Mahomet's recent review of his review on health inequalities, that how long we live, our health and well-being overall, and much more reflect our financial means. But on top of this, there's an independent and universal effect that reflects our position in a hierarchy, our status and our relative power. And it's the inequalities in power that I believe that this campaign for change in our electoral system has the potential to address. So power inequalities include inequalities in political power, but also around practical and everyday power, personal power, or self-efficacy. And in representative democracies such as the UK, the fundamental principle is that political power is vested equally in all eligible citizens who temporarily transfer this to the politicians they elect to use on their behalf. But as we know from the British Social Attitude Survey, that trust and confidence in politicians and our system is at an all-time low. And as Clive has just said, we also know that we've had falling turnouts at elections for decades. And we know that we have a surge in far-right populist parties. And that's the real threat to progressive democracies across Europe and the world. So is our electoral system contributing to this? And I would say yes. Obviously not exclusively, but I'd argue strongly that it is impacting on that. So our first past the post system has left many people feeling that their vote just doesn't count, it's wasted. And I would argue that people also feel disenfranchised and disengaged because of how politics and how, unfortunately, some politicians operate between elections. The adversarial, even aggressive behaviour in Parliament, the detachment of politicians from the electorate between elections, compounds the concept of power over instead of power with. And if you feel that you have so little control over many, many aspects of your life, this is just one bit, then you feel less inclined to give up. The feeling that politicians don't reflect them or their views is a very real one. So for me, a new democracy also needs to consider how we develop mechanisms for power with people. Devolution could help, but only when it looks to empower its citizens. It can't just be seen as another layer of governing. It must be about partnership with citizens as active participants, not passive recipients of services. So I believe citizens' assemblies, which you may be thinking of talking about at another stage here, Neil, such as we've seen in the recent Climate Assembly, are part of this mix. But we must also need to address other aspects of power inequalities around practical and personal power inequalities. So for me, this is a magnificent start, but it is just a start.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Debbie. And you're absolutely right. This is a cultural point, isn't it? Your thing about power with, not power over, is exactly right. And that's what we've got to shift our party towards. Thank you so much. Tessa, over to you, and tell us what you and Open Labour are doing about winning the party over to PR. Thank you.
Sure. So, hi everyone. Really nice to listen to everyone speak and make such incredible points. I'm going to start by saying a few things about how proportional representation can help contribute towards creating more inclusive, representative and collaborative democracy. I think we need to start by looking at the current state of our democracy here in the UK. We are seeing the dangers in real time of what happens when a party, which polls on a minority vote under first past the post, secures a huge disproportionate majority in the House of Commons. The result is a government intolerant of its own MPs, intolerant of any dissent, refusing any form of cooperation, dodging accountability, and funding a government of mediocre friends and family and donors and cronies with our money. A government elected by a minority, delivering an incompetent, corrupt, populist autocracy. And this is a de facto coalition of the old style Tory party with Farage's lot and the hard right. And their approach is to poll on or around 42% with their hard right Tory party de facto coalition, a minority of the vote, with a good chance of that securing permanent government under first past the post, spurred on by a series of invented or hugely inflated rows like dinghies invading across the Channel or the Rule Britannia row, which are designed to stoke up division, especially racist divisions, to fire up that small voting base. A culture war, if you like, which splits the country in two and drives us as an electorate and as a society apart. Proportional representation cannot, on its own, change the culture of how we are governed and are governed. It has to be part of a package of reforms which roots decision-making as close to the people as possible, like Debbie said, by those who are accountable to the people. So I believe the first casualty in pursuit of democratic accountability should be the House of Lords. It's an affront to democracy, and we need a second chamber elected by proportional representation. I think the second casualty will be our unwritten constitution. It's not fit for purpose, and as lawyers would say, it's not worth the paper it isn't written on. And I think the third casualty should be first past the post, to be replaced with a proportionally representative system which is fairer, fosters an atmosphere of collaboration in which division for division's sake struggles to thrive in the same way as it does under first past the post, and essentially rewarding this Tory party with majority governments. So it's not perfect, it's not easy, but I'm not trying to come up with solutions that are easy for politicians. It's about collaborative solutions which work for voters, which deliver functioning democracy and better governance. And we are seeing, of course, how fairer voting can work in the Labour Party. We've adopted the single transferable vote in some of our NEC elections. I'm one of those to blame for that. And the penny is dropping with most members that these winner-takes-all slates are of the past. Vicious attacks on opponents work against you. And ultimately, if elected, you are going to be working with some of your election rivals. To be successful in the STV system, winning candidates must appeal to a broader base of support by seeking second, third, fourth, and even lower voting preferences. So they have to work harder to earn your vote, which means for successful candidates, there's more accountability to a wider electorate and a better link between the voter and their NEC representatives. So it's more representative, more inclusive, gives the voter more choice and means that votes matter more. And I believe it is a vital step in the right direction towards healing some of the bitter divisions in our party. But bitter divisions continue to exist in politics outside of the Labour Party, bitter divisions which are being exploited by those in power. So we need proportional representation. We need a new democracy. Proportional representation would bring the possibility of collaborative, inclusive politics, reflecting the progressive majority, and a future that is negotiated rather than imposed. So I strongly urge you to invite a speaker from Labour for a New Democracy to your local Labour Party, or if you're also a trade union member like me, inviting a speaker to your union branch, helping spread the word about proportional representation. 3/4 of Labour Party members believe Labour should back PR, so our party policy on this should be changed to reflect that. Thank you.
Take myself off mute. Thanks so much, Tessa. Fantastic. Yeah, a future that is negotiated, not imposed. Exactly right. Exactly right. Last but absolutely not least is Mr. Alex Sobel. Thanks, Alex, for all you've been doing, and we look forward to hearing from you for 4 minutes. Thank you, mate.
Thanks, Neil. And I've been a supporter of proportional representation even before I got involved with you and Compass in 2004. Really, my support came from my involvement with my student union NUS, where we used STV, and I could see how much better it was than the way that we elected people to the council and to Parliament. And we obviously had the ever-presence of Ron, although I don't advocate that here and now for UK elections. But we need to convince many of our comrades now that we need to have some cold, hard facts about how proportional representation would further the cause of Labour, socialism, and the Labour movement. The Electoral Reform Society did analysis of the 2019 general election using the Hunt, which isn't a system I would ever support and is one of the least proportional of the proportional systems. But even under the Hunt, the result would have been that the Tories only got 288 seats and the Brexit Party 10 seats. People worry about letting parties like Brexit into Westminster, but that result, even with the DUP, would have left the Tories short of majority. And quite frankly, most of the RG act like they're in the Brexit Party anyway. It's a competition whether Cummings or Farage are more damaging. Under that same ERS analysis, Labour would have got 216 seats and the Greens 12. It wouldn't be an easy Parliament for Conservatives. We wouldn't be facing the internal market bill that we're having to look at this week and some of the other Tory excesses we're facing now. The 2017 general election analysis by ERS, even starker. They found that under STV, Labour would have won 297 seats, 287 seats that the Tories would have won. Under AMS, Labour would have won 260 seats, the Tories 273 seats under a more proportional system like STV. The 2017 general election would have ended up with a Labour government. In fact, the Conservatives wouldn't have won a majority in 15 of the last 16 general elections. We hear a lot about resources being allocated in the 2017 general elections, and as a 2017 Gain Labour MP, I know all about that. But we would have won that election. But first past the post aims a small number of marginal seats. So our resources go into these small number of marginals. And as we saw in 2017, if you get that wrong in a tight election, you lose. If your resources go to the wrong seats, you lose. In a more proportional system, you don't target resources so tightly, and you don't need to have such targeting judgment. So our recent experience really screams out for a more proportional system. What first past the post also does is it makes you try and target policies to those small number of target marginals. 2019 was an exception to that rather than the rule. That targeting in terms of policy tends to bring out more policies targeted at the centre, as safe seats can be triangulated out so you know you're going to win them. So PR can often allow for more radical policy making, which could still lead to electoral success, and something which has eluded us when we've been more radical. It could lead us to being able to have policies that are more radical on the climate, on workers' rights, on job creation and the economy, without worrying about focus groups from our top 10 marginals. There's also a broader argument of first past the post being a system at a time. Every European country uses a more proportional system than us, apart from Belarus. That's the peg we are hanging our democratic standard on, the failed state run by Lukashenko. Look at what is happening, what is going on here and in Belarus. What better argument is there for proportional representation, giving better governance and out first past the post than those two countries? In the UK, we have more proportional systems in devolved nations, and it's unfinished business here in the UK Parliament. We started the process of reform 20 years ago. In an act of uncompared political selflessness, our devolved parliaments are elected through PR. And in some places in Scotland in particular, it's the only thing that has meant socialism could survive electorally. Look at Scottish Labour in Westminster and the first past the post. That is what Scottish Labour would also look like in Holyrood if that was elected by first past the post. A fairer distribution of votes is not just fairer, but better for Labour. So Clive has asked you to take a motion to your CLPs, and Tess, a speaker to your Labour or Union branch. But the excellent Jane Speller, speaker at my Labour Party branch last year. But I'm going to ask you to pass a motion in your Union branch to gain an electoral reform policy in your union. They can also advocate for change in Labour policy. I want to finish with a quote from the great Robin Cook. We are not just interested in electoral reform for functional reasons, because we see it as a means to an end. The electoral system of the House of Commons is a crucial part of our democracy. The Labour Party democracy cannot be just viewed as a means, it's also a value which expresses how fair, how open, how equal we are in our society. At that moment, we're a democracy that fails to match that value. And that's why it's a matter of principle that we must insist on being changed. Our objective, our slogan, should be to achieve an electoral system which puts our democracy in the hands of the many voters, not the few voters who happen to be in key marginals. And Robin, God bless him, is as right now as he was when he wrote that over 20 years ago.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alex. We're running out of time a bit, so I'm just going to do a quick whiz round of fast answers. I've been looking at the Q&A and the chat thing, and it's really a question. I think there are two big questions. You know, what's the most persuasive thing that we can do to persuade our party? And then how are we going to, because we have to win an election in order to change the system, so how are we going to do that? And that brings in progressive alliance kind of stuff. So let's just do a quick whiz round with Debbie first, because I think you may have to go, Debbie. So what's the best way to persuade the party? Then how are we going to win an election with a mandate to get through PR? Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks, Neil. I think, I mean, from the introduction and so on, in terms of party members, I think we are pushing on an open door. I'm unclear, I have to say. I haven't got any figures, and perhaps Neil or Alex have got those, but I'm unclear in terms of how many of our PLP colleagues are supportive of PR or not. And I think that's obviously something that we need to do. From what I understand, and I've seen little bits in the chat, Keir has already made a statement about electoral reform and the support of that, and I think that's very important in terms of it being seen as a policy priority, and we need to build on that commitment. But also in terms of making sure that we are talking about it. So I'll be taking Tessa up on her offer, or any of the other groups that are part of this coalition for a new democracy to come and speak at my own CLP. I know, because I supported the AV referendum, and with all the caveats that that we had about that, you know, it wasn't successful, and I included my own CLP. I have to say, I was a very lone voice about this, so that we need to also make sure that everybody, as much as possible, is on side. But then I want to, you know, bring in the points that I also mentioned. It's not just about the electoral reform. For me, it's also about it's about engagement. It's about empowering communities, as I say, power with, not power over. And I think there's a lot that we need to do around that as well.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you much, Debbie. Tessa, over to you. The party and the country, how do we win them over as quickly as possible?
I think, you know, it's really easy to just say, look at the facts, but it's like all of the panelists have said already, the situation we're in, what first past the post is delivering for progressives and socialists. We need PR in order to have a hope of changing that. And I think another thing that will persuade people is using PR a lot more in the Labour Party. We've had a difficult few years in the Labour Party. STV in our NEC election is changing that. I can already feel the atmospheric difference in meetings and in this election online as well. And if we can do it in the Labour Party, we can do it in the country. We have to lead by example. I think that will persuade members.
Brilliant. I completely agree on the leading by example. Alex, over to you. What's your key message to win? You think is going to win over the party? Then how do we move from that to winning power to do something about it?
I think the big message is that it'll help us deliver more Labour governments. That's the big message. That's what Labour people want. They want to be in government and in power. And actually, we've got a much more fluid membership now, haven't we? I mean, we haven't got any Greens on here, but you know, how many former Green Party members joined the Labour Party in the last 5 years? A lot. You know, the membership's a lot more fluid. People have come in under Keir's leadership again. A lot of those have been members of other parties who support, proportional representation, and obviously the Europe issue as well. And actually, what I'd say is about the PLP is that attitudes are hugely shifting. If you talk to members of the PLP that came in 15, 17 and 19, that's the vast majority of the PLP now. None of them are like, I would rule out changing the voting system. Some of them are like, well, I need to be reassured about the constituency link. And even some MPs that have been in a lot longer are now saying, well, now's the time for us to reevaluate. Things are a lot better. There are a small hardcore of opponents. And actually, when we had it at our branch, you have the same thing. One person will stand up and vocally oppose it and will bring up a number of arguments. And then that will, unfortunately, in the Labour Party, this has happening, that will lead the opinion of others who are more soft supporters or unsure. And then we'll move them into the status quo position. And that's what we need to really guard against. A few lone voices shouting very loud. And so we need to have a broad coalition that brings people with us.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. And finally, over to you, Clive, the party and the country. Unmute yourself, Lewis.
Yeah. For MPs in particular, talk MPs first. I think look, people might be a bit surprised at this, but and I think some of the panel may agree. Labour MPs don't tend to be very political. I've been accused of being too political twice in my first year as an MP when I got there in 2015. And what I think many of them, not all, will respond to is the fact that there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of party members who are passionate about this and who support it. And I think you'll find that many of them are kind of equivocal about PR. It's something they haven't really put their minds to. But when they understand that their membership and their CLPs and people in the party care passionately about this, and that it is an important part of our strategy to change the world for the better, change our country for the better, I think more of them will swing around and get behind it. So I think there's hope there for the PLP, definitely. I think for the membership, I think, look, and I think for the party generally, we have to understand that the Tories have shifted. You know, the Tory party has morphed again. And there is now a big difficulty for us on economic policy when the Tories are spending so much. So being able to define ourselves by investment, it's what you're investing in which is important, but being able to define ourselves by the sheer numbers is something which is going to be very difficult. So where we can now offer an alternative is on a radical democratic offer. And I think when you look at what happened on Brexit and how the Tories have been able to tap into that disillusionment of many working people who were formerly Labour, that democracy isn't working for them. Take Back Control was exactly about that. Democracy isn't working. The Tories keep playing on this. Well, let us come at that head on and say, we know it isn't working, and we have some real answers to be able to tackle this. And I think we will have, for the 2024 manifesto, a real radical manifesto, which offers something the Tories can come nowhere near. How do we get to PR overall? Look, you know, people know my views on this. It is quite clear to me that if we are serious about forming a government in 2024 with the climate crisis looming, we don't have another 10 years to wait for a Labour government. We've got to do it in 2024. We look at what's happening in Scotland. We've got to be realistic about this. PR would be the glue, the cement to a pact to get us over the line in 2024. Let the Liberal Democrats fight the centre ground. Let us fight where we're comfortable fighting. Let the Greens can't be comfortable where they're fighting. Let's get over that line. And then the agreement is we bring in constitutional reform. I think that's the only way we're going to do it in 2024. And that's how we get PR.
Brilliant. Thanks, Clive. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Tessa and Debbie, who's disappeared. Look, I've been campaigning for PR in the Labour Party since Robin Cook made that comment, Alex, and I've never felt it's more possible. We're on the edge of something huge here, and if we can bring all these ideas and these people together, Make Votes Matter and LCR and ERS and Open Labour and everybody else encompass the rest, we can really do this. And the only tool in our locker as social democrats is democracy. Dare more democracy is the only thing we can do everywhere, and PR opens the door to the kind of society that we want. That this campaign is central to everything that we believe in and everything that we want. So thanks all the speakers. Thank you for your comments and your questions. I hope you've enjoyed that. Over to you, Joe, to sort out the rest of the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Neil. And yeah, thank you to all the panel. That was great. And I think we're really clear on what we need to do. This section of the meeting is going to be about how we're going to do it. And I'm going to talk through very briefly just the sort of strategy that we're proposing as Labour for a New Democracy. And then we're going to, if the technology allows it, we're going to go into some breakout groups and have a bit of a discussion. So hopefully you can all see my screen. And I'm just going to run through this very, very quickly. Basically, the fundamentals are really good. As we've heard, we have 3/4 or thereabouts of Labour members who believe we need to back PR. And what this means in theory, and what we have found to be true in practice, is almost any Labour branch or Labour CLP where you can table a motion, that motion will be carried. There's 1 or 2 examples out of the sort of 85 CLPs that have already carried a motion of motions being sort of narrowly rejected, or people that have concerns and don't take them forward. In general, anywhere we put one down, we'll take one forward. So the challenge in a very major way is to get those motions tabled. And that's the first of our very simple set of actions, which we'll be inviting all of you on this call to take. We have on the website a list, I won't show it now, but a list of all the CLPs that have already come out in favour of PR. Check that list, and if yours isn't on it, then please table a motion as soon as possible. This is just one going to the National Policy Forum. It doesn't have to go to conference at this stage or anything of that nature. Just get your CLP on the record as being in favour. And if we can get a really overwhelming number of CLPs behind PR within the next few months or so, I think it really strengthens the hand of the leadership and of all of those senior people in the party who want the party to back PR, because they need the political capital to make that happen. Secondly, invite a speaker to your branch or CLP. I should say, please don't wait before putting a motion forward in order to do this. You can do both at the same time. The reason is it can take 6 months, sometimes even a year, to actually get a speaker arranged and out to a meeting. We don't have time to sort of wait for that everywhere. So just put a motion forward and invite a speaker at the same time if it'll be useful to have one. Thirdly, so although motions of this kind, this just policy motions to the National Policy Forum, are really, really important, they don't have the kind of teeth that you need to actually force a change through. Now, it may be that if we get enough support built up over the next few months, we don't even need to go to conference. That would be a very good place to be. But in all likelihood, we will have to take this issue to conference next year. So just please be ready to table a conference motion at your CLP next year. We can take a whole load to conference and hopefully get it on the conference floor and actually change policy. And finally, for bonus points, trade unionists. And hopefully many of you are trade unionists. You should join a union for all sorts of reasons if you haven't already. But those of you who are probably want your union to have a good policy on electoral reform. Again, we've got a list so you can check where yours is. Some of them already do have policy in favour. Some of them have policy against. But the biggest unions of all don't have any policy either way, and we still need to change those because they will vote against proposals at conference by default otherwise. To do all of this, all of these actions, we need to be making lots of phone calls, and one of the breakout sessions is going to be on phone banking, where we'll talk a bit about how you can get involved in that for this project and reach out to other Labour members to get them on board. Right, so we're now going to transition this entire meeting over to another Zoom call. And the reason for that is this format of meeting we can't do breakouts in. So I'd like everyone to get this URL. I'm going to paste it in chat as well. And basically we will end this call, and then please just put that URL into your browser, click on it, and it will take you straight on to the next Zoom call where we'll have everyone pre-assigned to the right breakout room, or most of you pre-assigned to the right breakout room. If you get lost, we have emailed this link to all of you as well, so you should be able to find it there. So I am just going to stop sharing my screen and paste in chat that URL. Okay, is everyone happy with what we're doing? Great, so we're going to close this call and we will see you on the breakout session in just a few moments.